Deputy Marc Ó Cathasaigh, Ton Oireachtas inis.
Thank you very much. No flies on Gino, but the odd midge apparently up around. No ticks around here. Yeah, no flies. Minister, I met recently with an ecologist that I know, who works very closely with developers as part of her role, and she gave me a very simple message, and I think it's a message that you'll appreciate. Like, we're some 3 years in government, just gone 3 years in government. And we spend a lot of time up against the coalface, and sometimes we don't actually get to see the road that we've travelled. She gave me a very simple message. She said, keep at it, it's working. And that was a good message to hear. And she was saying in the context of the work that she does, working with developers, working to develop planning permissions. She said not so long ago, the biodiversity provisions within a planning application or treatments of sustainable drainage, your SUDs and all the rest of it, that would have been very peripheral, very last minute, just tacked on to the end, an afterthought. And she said there's been a sea change, where actually now developers are engaging with her proactively. And before they put the planning permission in, they're asking, well, what are we doing about SUDs in this development? What are we doing to make sure that we have no net loss of biodiversity over the course of this development? So it was a good message to hear. We don't often hear the positive ones. Keep at it, it's working. I think that really applies to your work in the MPWS. There's been a sea change in the organisation since the formation of this government, and in particular since you took the ministry in this regard and brought, I think, a real impetus and a real focus to that role of the need to reform and expand the MPWS. Because there is no doubt that the job of work we have in front of us is very substantial. And notwithstanding what my colleague Deputy Bruton was saying earlier, yeah, there is a worry that you can express this too bleakly, or that you can lose people by outlining what is in fact the reality of the situation. So many of our bird species, our fish species, our native plants are in serious danger. And as I've said before, there is no comeback from extinction. This decline needs to be halted, because we need to, as I think all generations want to do, they want to hand on what they've received to the next generation in good order. That has to be a principle for us. In fact, it's a principle of sustainable development, that you provide for the needs of this generation without inhibiting the needs of future generations to be able to provide for those needs. And I think it returns to something that I often talk about, and that is, I suppose, the insufficiency of things like GDP to actually fully measure what is good within our economy, and the fact that things like GDP and how that's been constituted in our current iteration of capitalism and that late stage neo-capitalism, it doesn't pay any attention to the fact that that economic model is world-eating. And we pay no attention to the four capitals: our social capital, our human capital, and our natural capital, particularly. That's not, GDP is blind to that. It doesn't care how many forests you plough up. It only really cares about how many rolls of toilet paper you sell, or whatever it is, toothpicks, matches, whatever else. So we have a job of work to do in terms of recasting, I suppose, our whole view on society. The MPWS is extremely important. It's kind of the figurehead for those nature movements, and there's so many projects, and I know you've done a huge job of work in terms of attracting more funding into it. We still have to address the fact that it's been historically understaffed, and it's been historically underprovided for in terms of the wealth of expertise and knowledge that's available to do it. And there's been an issue around the funding of staffing. I know a number of people who signed on to become rangers because they love nature, and then for financial reasons felt that they had to move elsewhere with their considerable talents, expertise and qualifications, that there were other outlets that would allow them to get their mortgage, raise their family, pay for school books, all of those things that need to be done. So that's something that needs to be addressed. The skills and the skills deficit, or the availability of skills, and this piece of workforce planning, that's something that needs to be addressed as well. And actually, that ecologist that I mentioned at the start, that was another message, I suppose, a less positive one that she gave me. Well, there's positives in it as well. She said there's more and more need for people with these skills. She was flat out. She said, I have to turn down work. I'm absolutely flat out. But there's no place in Ireland that trains for those skills. People have to go to, I think, Birmingham is the closest place that you can get that specific skill set. And we're going to need them. We're going to need them not just in the MPWS, but all across society. Ecologists, hydromorphologists, the fellows who know how to work the diggers to set up the leaky dams. You know, all of those things around restoration of our wetlands, restoration of our bogs, our Annex 1 habitats. All of those skills are things that we have to factor in for. And I think we have to get out there and tell people, yeah, there's jobs here. In the same way we're trying to do around renewables, about retrofitting, or around installation of solar. We're telling people, look, there's jobs here, lads. There's jobs here for the next coming decades, and they'll be good jobs. We need to do the same in terms of jobs in nature. Because our response to the climate crisis and our response to the biodiversity crisis must in fact be layered, one on top of the other. Going back to that idea of keep at it, we are making a difference, I was very heartened by the vote last night in terms of the nature restoration law. And I demur from what Deputy Bruton said earlier. I don't think there were people finger pointing in that. I think there was a narrative created that wanted somebody to be coming out finger pointing. I don't think that's what was at play at all. And the more actually we've had talk and discussion about the scale of the challenge posed by the nature restoration law, absolutely the need for that multi-annual financial framework that will have to underpin it if we're in any way serious about it. But the more that we've talked through it, the more that people have seen that this, yeah, is an absolute necessity. And so interesting to see people the likes of Nestle. Now, you wouldn't expect necessarily to be lining up behind a nature restoration law, coming out and very strongly making the call in tandem with all of the scientists and all of the environmentalists. It was unusual to see those voices line up in support. And I think it was very significant here yesterday evening to see three of the largest groups, well, four of the largest groups, including the Greens, within the European Parliament. Of course, you'd expect the Greens to be fully behind the NRL. But in seeing the position of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Sinn Féin yesterday evening, we saw represented three of those large voting blocs within the European Union coming out and voicing support for the nature restoration law. I think that was important. And actually, our colleague, Deputy Ledden, tweeted about it. I looked at his quote tweet, or looked at quote tweets of his tweet. They appear in a number of languages because the Germans paid attention to what happened here yesterday evening. The French paid attention to what happened here yesterday evening. It was a significant vote. We're making a difference. Keep at it. So all of these things are important. Look, I mean, we could go into the chapter and verse of all of those habitats we need to redevelop. The fact that I've talked before about the shifting baseline syndrome. Actually, I think it would be a really interesting social history project, Minister, before we lose the knowledge of our older people, for them to be interviewed and for us to write down those people who can remember the 40s, the 30s, and what our wildlife was then. Because, as I said, my boys haven't that experience. They haven't seen the salmon shoaling. They've never heard the cuckoo call in the southeast. So I think it'd be an interesting social project for us to take on. I did want to just briefly touch on the meeting of PAC this morning, where we met Inland Fisheries Ireland. And it was a difficult meeting for the representatives that were there. There's no doubt that there's issues around corporate governance. The Minister had to step in and take a strong stand on it. And those are things that had to be resolved. And there was a tension in the room because Inland Fisheries Ireland were coming to us and saying, we have 320 staff, we need 520. And I agree with them. They absolutely do. And the role that they perform is actually very complementary to the role that the MPWS performs. But the central point that we were making then, and I know that a lot of the work that you have done around reviewing the MPWS, if somebody is making the case for a 61% increase in their staffing function, well, they have to be able to stand over the corporate governance, because we as, I suppose, overseers of the public purse have to be sure that the money is well spent. But it does give us that broader issue. We got to get serious about how we fund nature. We have to understand that our economy depends on our ecology, that one is the subset of the other, and we very often understand it the wrong way around. And if we are serious about addressing issues of climate change and biodiversity loss, if we're serious about issues of nature restoration, then we better get serious about funding it. And that's about providing funding for the landowners, absolutely. If people are being encouraged to manage their land in a particular way, they need to be funded for it. But it's also about funding those oversight bodies like the MPWS, like IFI, to make sure that that work is happening. Thank you, Ken Corley.
Thank you, Deputy Cathasaigh. Deputy Sean Kenny.